And one of the first things we'd like to check in with you about is, did you have a chance to read the articles?
Yes.
Great. Well, we wanted to start off with some, I should say, I'm not the leader of our group. I'm just currently speaking for a group. So join in if you have uh, facilitating questions that can move us forward. But I think we wanted to start off with a couple poll questions just to get a feel for how you've been thinking about quantitative social justice in your own work. So I'm going to go ahead and launch our first poll. I'm waiting on just a couple more people. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and show you the results. Have you heard that quantitative methods are racist? Can you see?
What we see, there we go. Yeah.
So see, about 69% of us have said yes, and 31% have said no. So maybe you could use the chat or share with us a little bit about why you responded the way that you did.
I will talk about, it was a relatively new realization for me. So it was in the last about 4 years or so. It was right after I got this position, and was having a conversation with people in the hallway who said something along the lines of, but you seem like you care about social justice issues. How could you possibly be a quantitative researcher?
Wow.
And I said, what are you talking about? And that was the beginning of my like reading more into that, because I had literally never heard it, never experienced it until about 4 years ago.
My exposure was very similar to Jessica's. I have been doing math my whole life, so it was never, it felt like a natural move for me to continue on in my research in the math mode. But it wasn't until I became a professor, I actually started attending conferences, that I saw there were very, very few Blacks doing quant work. And I started asking some questions like, well, where is everybody? Where are we at? And people ask me, not quite the same way Jessica, but I think what is more real than it being racist is that it's been inaccessible to the Black community. And then I would hear things like, well, numbers are generalizable, they don't really tell the whole story, and these theories don't apply to Black people that they're teasing apart. So yeah, there are some real strong opinions about quant. And I didn't know there was a quant qual war either, because I was a mixed methodologist. I was trained a mixed methodologist. So that was an awakening too. Like, you almost had to pick a side. And I'm like, I can't pick a side if I can do both. So
I'll share a little story. My undergrad was in psychology, and in our psych department, it was very heavily quantitative. There were no professors of color at all, and most of them were men too. But I was just happy to be studying psychology. I loved it, and I didn't think about all that stuff. But the research that I decided to do in my master's work, I had already thought of it in my undergraduate. And the study was about African American teenage girls who were parents and who were successful in school. And where I didn't get from the criticism that it was like, they didn't use the words racist. What they said was that this was like my first master's class. It was a research methods class. I went in there all proud, presenting my little quantitative study or whatever. Those people ripped me to shreds. My classmates, they were from the fields of adult education and social foundations, and they were like, are you trying to give these girls a voice, or what are you trying to do? Because what you're doing is ignoring their experience with this. It's very positivistic. I mean, whoo, it was rough. And that was kind of like the first realization that I had that, okay, something's going on here, that I didn't realize was happening. And then also, that is when I found that there was this war. That's when the war, the war first became noticeable, is that all those people that were giving me all that crap were all qualitative researchers. They did not believe in quant research. And I just didn't see it as it had to be in opposition. I looked at it as these are two sides of inquiry that feed into each other, really. So it was shocking, but it was enlightening and it was helpful. Oh, can I read this from Jay? Jay in the chat. I really started hearing about it this past summer, and I've been reading more about it since then, reading the Thicker Than Blood book now, all about the history of statistics in relation to the eugenics movement. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm interested in hearing people's thoughts about how, the particular readings we shared, especially the first one on positionality, how it really helped you think, or did it change your thinking about how to approach quantitative research with an eye to social justice?
If we engage in dialogue, please make sure the responses are brief so you'll be able to get through everything that you need to get through, or put them in the chat. Thank you.
I will say I've started putting positionality statements in my papers that I'm writing now. So sort of explicitly saying this is where I'm coming from, which I had never done before.
What kind of things do you put in your statements? Like,
let's see. The one I wrote this week was the first author is trained in quantitative methods, and so we take a quantitative approach to these questions.
Okay, yeah.
Has anyone else had experience writing?
I was just going to add that, I've read a few qualitative pieces and I've seen those positionality statements. And I want to say it was about a year ago when Stephen Quay came and gave his talk. And it was so inspirational to hear how he positioned his research. And as a quantitative researcher, I'm always mindful of, what I bring to the table, and the authors talk about the inside outside position, because I think that as researchers, we are all, regardless of, what our beginnings were, we are now in a place of privilege. I mean, we have PhDs, we are in control of our research. And it's just so important for us to always be mindful of the group in which we are conducting our research on, and just to be respectful of that. I know a lot of times in my evaluation classes, I have the conversation with my students and talk about, going into communities that, are not communities that you would normally be in, but this is a group that you're interested in, and how you need to be sensitive and understand, the culture, the norms, because you don't want to disrespect people. You don't want to marginalize them, probably more than they are currently being marginalized. And so it was just that idea of the inside outside, because I think sometimes, we are privileged. We are in a privileged position, and that we need to be mindful of that, regardless of, I am a Black woman. Yes, I'm already in a group or several groups, but also just keeping in mind that, I am one of very few who have a PhD, which then puts me at another level when we're talking about social economics. So it's just important to just always be mindful. And I think, these positionality statements, I think, are really crucial And it's something that I need to make sure that I still address, even though I'm still being mindful, but to write it down so that as I am, looking at my analyses, even the questions and so forth, that I'm always just mindful of it.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Dorinda. I've had some of the same experience in evaluation work in particular. I think it's, there's been a culture of thinking about, our inside outsideness and the groups that we're working with. But I don't see it so much in other areas of quantitative work. So I think it's, it's important to reflect on that as we're approaching our data and our analyses. Thanks for posting that definition of positionality, Tracy, in the chat.
Yeah.
Should we read it out for people?
Sure, I can read it out.
Okay.
This came from the article that we sent. Sufla, Sidat, and Bawa, I know I'm murdering the names, I apologize, define positionality as the researcher's social location, personal experience, and theoretical viewpoint, the relational and institutional context of the research, and the bearing of these elements on the research process itself. The way I have always thought of positionality is how I show up in terms of race, gender, all that stuff, right? Socioeconomic status, my belief systems, right? But also how other people see me based on the visible manifestations of those things. And again, that first study I did, my master's program, is where I first learned about that, because that population was very sensitive population, right? So even though I come from a background of, I'm familiar with teenage parenthood, raised in a similar neighborhood as the subjects, the participants of my study, I still had to remember that I am coming into this with still different, because I'm working on a master's degree here. I come from a family of people. My mom was a single teenage mom, but she got a doctorate. So we're coming from these positions and from the university. So the girls were going to see me based on that, not just how I see myself, but how the world sees me as well.
One of the things that I took away from the article that I hadn't really thought about, but I agree with both Tracy and Dorinda, even having come from the community, even going back to do the research in the community, is the differentiation or differential of power, I guess, that also comes with positionality. And, maybe socioeconomic lends into that, but the fact that you are in a different status, I think, flips. You just have to be very sensitive, to the fact that you're coming back into the community, but you're coming back in with different eyes.
Should we move on to the next poll? Somewhat related to our first question, do you believe that quantitative methods are racist? Just a few more folks. All right, so here's our results. 43% said no, but 36% hadn't thought about it. So what are your takeaways from that? Are you surprised or not surprised?
I'll hop in here because I have to leave at 10:30. But I don't think the methods in and of themselves are racist. I think interpretations are often racist. And I think that can be the case across any methodology, but oftentimes, because if you look at STEM fields and fields where there's more quantitative methods, what was I going to say? there's one is, I guess, respected more than the other, I guess, on a larger scale. I'm forgetting the language I've used before, but it's what's valued. And so I think how the methods get, or how the findings get interpreted, often lead to racist conclusions, like the bell curve, and these books where people take information and they put statistics out there with no context or information to help people understand.
Right. So validity of use. Yeah. Well, it has made me think. These readings I found to be really interesting, especially in light of the way that quantitative research, well, not, I guess we can separate analysis of quantitative data with how the data is collected. So there's like two different arms to quantitative research, but certainly there's been such a history of misuse of quantitative data, or studies that have maligned certain groups or taken advantage of certain groups, and that contributes to this belief that quantitative methods are inherently racist. And so I do think it's important to be mindful of the validity of use of the research that we're conducting.
This is really timely for me because I'm teaching intro to stats for the first time in over a decade. I taught it many, many times when I was back at UK. I haven't taught it for a while. I'm teaching it now. And over the summer, when I was sort of updating my course, it really dawned on me that when I taught this, 15 years ago, we didn't think twice, most people who taught it, and I know a lot of people taught it, about when we simply use variables that are like gender or sex or ethnicity or race, and we used them very freely back then. And it really dawned on me that we're living in a different world now, and that it's not, you can't really do it the same way. And I talked with a bunch of folks and just, asked people like how they handle it. And I really spent a lot of time thinking about in the summer, like, how do I teach these students about this in a way that is going to be really get them to think about this the right ways. And so in the end, I didn't have an easy answer. So I just, in the first class, we had a discussion about it. And I just said that this is something that is really, really the decisions you make about how you include variables and how you categorize. I mean, like, we used to just say male, female, period. And now, like, well, that works if you're talking about biological sex, but it doesn't work, And, ethnicity, there were very distinct categories that don't really work. And there's ethnic identity, and there's so many more things. So we just had a conversation about it in the first class. And I think that was the best thing to do, because I said, I don't know the answers either, but I think the important thing is that we think about how before we do the research, about how we do this and why we do this. And if we're going to include variables like this, why are we doing that? Sometimes there might be reason to, but sometimes there isn't a reason to. And so, it's really complicated, but I think a lot of it starts there. But that's been a really challenging thing to think about how to approach that.
Thank you.
A life-changing.
Yeah, Donna had her hand up. Sorry.
Oh, thank you, Karen. A life-changing book for me as a doc student was Stephen Jay Gould's The Mismeasure of Man. And I think that's a timeless book. But beyond that, I wanted to say, I think we do our students a disservice, whether we're talking about quantitative, qualitative, or mixed message, when we say or pretend that research is neutral. Every aspect of the research process is biased. From why you chose the certain design, who you chose to study, how you framed your question, what instruments you chose to use, how you interpreted your data. So it's racist, and yes, there's sexism there as well.
Well said. I think many of us are in agreement with that.
Thank you.
I feel like that's what the article on position.
Someone else have something to add to that thought, or anything that struck them related to that? That's
Karen, were you getting ready to say something?
No, Tracy, I thought I just couldn't hear you. Can you come in a little closer to your microphone?
This little thing is acting up with me again today. Hold on. Okay, can you hear me now?
A little bit better.
What about now?
That's worse. Go back the other way.
That's worse. Okay, it's iffy over here sometimes with my
There you go. You're
technology.
good.
Okay, there we go.
There you
What I
go.
was going to say was the article talked about that. At the end of the positionality article, if you didn't have a chance to read the whole thing, skip to the end later and you'll see the author talks about how every part of the research process has to be addressed if we really want to look at making it more sensitive to these issues.
Yeah. And I think that, Eric, when you were describing, changing your first class to address that, I know, Jessica, you've talked about what you've done in your classes, and a couple of others of us in CREM have had that conversation. But I think it needs to be beyond those classes, even for quantitative work. I was invited to another colleague's class last week, and one of the questions that I had from the students was related to a validated survey and the use of a validated survey. And I was what Donna was explaining. It's not the piece of paper, it's not the survey or the instrument that's validated. It's really how we use it. And that's what we should be questioning when we're deciding on measures to include. And even what I really liked about the positionality paper was the reminding of questioning our assumptions as from where we're coming from in a place of privilege for our race or ethnicity or gender or whatever, and getting feedback from the participants on what these measures actually mean to them. And that's something that I think we do think about from an evaluation perspective, but in other arenas in quantitative work, I don't see it as widely used. That questioning, Jessica, did you want to share about the article or the approach that you took in your class that you shared with us a little?
Sure. I wrote a little bit about it in the chat, but just what you all were talking about there is the fact that all of the choices we make are motivated by our unconscious biases or conscious biases in some extent. But so one of the ways that I started class this year, Eric, I'm happy to share these articles with you if you'd like to send them out, was some really brief articles about the history of quantitative methods as being used deliberately for racist purposes. Like, the quantitative methods that we use every day were developed by people who were attempting to prove that white people were better than Black people. And so we can't get past that until we acknowledge that. And I, having studied quantitative methods for years, had never heard that. So I tried to make it really, I think I froze.
We can hear you, Jessica. Keep going. Oh, now you did freeze.
Okay, well, does anyone have something to share on that, or should we go to the next poll question?
Just that I'm intrigued by those articles. I hope she'll share those with us as well.
Yeah, I was just writing some down, and a couple of us have mentioned books or readings that we've liked. So one thing we can do is
Put those in
maybe
the
pull
chat.
together at the end. We can send out a couple that we've that we've heard. And if there's something that really struck you, a reading or a resource, you can put it in the chat, and we'll try to incorporate that on a resource list.
Yeah, I think also too, that's what makes this hard. That's what makes this whole issue difficult is people don't want to talk about it. We have a lot of feelings around the past and what happened and the bad stuff that was done and the lasting residue of those things that are affecting us. It makes people feel bad. They don't want to talk about that, you know? So that's why these conversations are so important, that we could just get it out there and just start talking about it.
I know.
Another book, Karen, I keep interrupting you.
No, not me. Go ahead.
Oh, and I don't know why this book resonates with me right now, but the one, I can't remember the author's name, but Even the Rat Was White. I don't know if any of you, did you hear me, Karen?
Yeah, you said Even the Rat Was White?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I read that a long time ago, although, it focuses on psychology. I think is very appropriate for this conversation. And, it might be a good read. It might be an update, but, still from a historical perspective, I'm not saying it really focuses, well, it does focus on history, but I'm saying even though it might be dated, you could just take that date off and put 2021.
Thank you. Jessica, if you are still with us, and I see that you're off the screen, you mentioned quite a few articles that you shared. If you would throw those in the chat, at the end of this, people can grab the chat and do some exploration on their own. I did want to say, Anne, we're at 10:30. I kind of like to leave a few minutes at the end for people to discuss. So if you want to move into the next article, I think it's probably a good idea to do so.
Okay. All right, so we have another poll question then. So this is, do you include race, sex, or gender indicators in your quantitative studies? Waiting on a couple more. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and end polling. This will be shocking to everyone. 100%. So I guess related to that, maybe we should go ahead and jump into our next question. So
Before we do that, and I'd like to make a comment.
mhm.
With that question, I'm thinking about the COVID vaccine and how certain groups of color, primarily Black, but not exclusively, are hesitant to take the vaccine because we have been underrepresented in what's in medicine trials. I can't think right now. I don't like to be long-winded, but in these trials. So if we were in a class right now, I think that would be a good example to give to students, because it does affect validity, reliability, fears, interpretation of results,
Yeah,
generalizability, and more. So to have colorblind studies, to me, does a disservice. Colorblind and culture blind, a disservice to any piece of work.
yeah, I agree. But I will share, one of the struggles that I've experienced in my classes is that I want to bring these issues to the forefront about how we use the data that collect, even secondary data, how it's used and who was in the sample and who was excluded, and what the history is of sampling and exclusion. And it's really just, it is disturbing. I know, as all of you know, but finding the articles that are say keen enough for an intro class, those are different than than how I need to get this discussion into a much more advanced class when students have actually had a couple courses in introductory statistics. So that's just something that I feel I've struggled with, and what I'd like to get some suggestions on, because I've always found it easier to bring up these issues and even take a day to discuss the history of the Tuskegee study. That's very extremely high level quantitative data that was collected on a complete group of people that were abused, and but that's harder to talk about that in an intro class. So that's where I struggle kind of with the balance.
Let me just add to Tuskegee in case any students wants to discount, oh, that was way back when. Just look at sterilization in North Carolina as much more recent, and how they were sterilizing Black women and others without their consent. And maybe in the last, I don't know, 5 years, these women just finding out, or maybe 10, they're just finding out why they can't have children. So sterilized without their consent. So that's another one that really gets to me.
I don't want to cut anyone off who might have something to share, but I think we'll go ahead and do the next polling. And this again is related to the first one, but we're interested in talking through what steps people may have taken in terms of how indicators around or measures of race, sex, or gender have been used or collected in your quantitative studies. So more concrete than just thinking about it. Just a couple more people we're waiting on. All right, so I'll go ahead and end this polling. So we can see 70% have taken steps to change how they've included these variables in their quantitative work. And a couple people haven't yet thought about it. So hopefully through our discussion here, you'll at least be pushed a little bit in that direction. So would someone like to go ahead and share some of their experiences with how they've changed either measures or how they've asked questions about these constructs from a practical standpoint?
Just want to briefly share my experience. So I was teaching this multi-level modeling using the HLM book, the route ambush and Brax. And the very basic model, there is a variable gender, and it's named as gender. It's coded as male, female. And so I was just using it without really thought about it. And one of the students at the end of the class, he approached me and kind of corrected me. That's not appropriate. You should use in this way, not that way. So that was the first time that I was like, I haven't thought about that. And maybe I should be more sensitive to use those variables. But because I'm using that as a textbook example, I'm not really changing it, but I'm just making some comments. So I can see a lot of things like that happens in quantitative studies. So
I think a lot of that happens in textbooks, mostly because for quantitative research, we're looking for models that will teach that particular analysis. And it's too easy to just use the variable called gender or use the variable called minority, without really thinking about what that means. And that's what, so what if we're teaching analysis of covariance with this predictor? If we're not and I will admit I struggle with this myself, but if we're not taking the time to really get students to think about what it means, how we interpret results in light of how we've measured, or even if it's secondary data, how it came to us. I think there really needs to be like a sea change on how we talk about these things in the classroom, beyond what we're doing in our own research.
I agree. So
So
while I was reading these chapters and articles, I kind of felt bad because I was one of those who make excuses that I don't need much time to cover all these necessary things to teach stats. So I can't really discuss about other like these topics in the class. But I feel at the same time, this is an important topic that we should talk about with the grad students, because we are training the future researchers. So if they are trained in the same way that we've been trained, this cannot be really moving forward. So
make sure you're capturing the conversation that's in the chat. There's some good resources over there. Also, Scott mentioned also looking into the shift in population that was abused from the African American to South America. And just capture that when you can, but we'll go ahead with the conversation.
Well, I do want to point out, Jessica also made an important point in the chat as well, that sometimes the extremes, like the Tuskegee study, are so shocking that students pushed themselves no farther in understanding what was going on. So looking for other examples of that can help make sure they're aware that it's still happening. The misuse of variables and interpretation of data based on how it was collected. So I like that comment.
And can I add one point? And I'm going to use Donna from Friday morning. She gave the example that, if you're trying to get people to see equity, for example, that sometimes using skin color doesn't work. But if you show like someone is, disabled, or in her expression, it was ability has a way of resonating better with people. So I wonder if there aren't ways from a quantitative perspective to use those similar examples to get people to really see, no, this is a big deal. That it's not as simple as just saying, well, that's male or female. Like, I think maybe that's a good thing for all of us to think about, because that really struck me, as I can think of lots of people in my family that if they said, well, someone can't ride a bicycle, they'd fall over themselves to help. But if you give different examples, they might dismiss it, or that's too extreme. So that, I think that's applicable as well.
Yeah, thanks.
We've been in these couple of new big studies that I've had going this year, had so many conversations with graduate students and with colleagues about how to ask, how to incorporate demographic items and how to ask them. And generally, I'm personally, and I think a lot of people in the field are moving toward letting, if you're going to collect those data, letting the respondent give the categories rather than me as a researcher giving the categories. That being said, when you're doing research with children, which we are particularly in one of these studies, you have to consider developmental issues, and children sometimes can't answer a question like that as easily because they don't know, they don't really know what you mean, and they don't have the same frames of reference. So it's complicated. And I guess what I'm saying is you have to consider whom you're asking the questions to also developmentally. I mean, there's lots of other things that play into it, but particularly I've just been thinking about developmentally, because children and adolescents and adults, just, purely on a developmental level, without even beginning to think about the impacts of culture and other things, answer those questions in different ways. The other thing is, it is definitely, I think, a strength when you ask people to report for themselves. From a research perspective, when you have a study with 3,000 people in it, it creates an issue on the back end of, do you have the resources then to be able to take those data and do something with it? And so when you do that, you have to realize on the back end that somebody's got to go in there and make sense of it. And then at the end of the day, we're going to be making a judgment and saying, well, are we going to take all these rich descriptions that people gave and then lump them into groups that we made up? So these are all things that I think a lot of researchers are dealing with in the moment and trying to.
Thank you.
Oh, were you going to say something?
No, I just said thank you. A little louder, Tracy. You're on soft again.
Here we go again on soft.
There
Okay.
you go. There you go.
Another thing that I think about too with regard to that, and this is, I'm going to be a little bit vulnerable here with one of the things that I struggle around. Dustin, I'm glad you brought up the issue around disability, because I struggle sometimes with remembering, and I have to work at it to make things accessible, to make sure that everything is accessible for everybody, okay, regardless of whatever their personal circumstance might be. And so when I think about the gender issue and what Eric just said about the work it takes to accommodate all the differences, I kind of understand that we need to, that we have to embrace the work. We have to embrace the work, that it's going to take me a little longer to produce that video now because I'm going to have to caption that. Okay. If I want to use a video, or not use one, or whatever. So it makes it so that we have to not be lazy. I sound like my mother now. You don't want to be lazy. And I usually never say that word. I always say unmotivated, because I don't really believe in laziness. But I do sometimes think we just don't want to be bothered with all of that. Just like with the gender issue, we don't want to be bothered with understanding that someone who is born female with female organs may not identify as female. We don't want to deal with what that means. Sometimes we are phobic about that. Sometimes we just don't want to be bothered with the thinking that it takes to remember to use gender neutral pronouns or to ask someone what your pronouns are. So sometimes it's about being able to embrace doing the extra work that it takes to include everybody in our work that we do.
Thanks,
Well,
Tracy.
going back to Dustin, I have an activity that I use, and I call it pyramid of comfort and discomfort. And in that activity, which is like anonymous, I ask students, I share like a dozen or so social demographic variables. And I ask students, and it's color coded, like red means I'm really uncomfortable. Gray means I'm very comfortable talking about this and being around people, who fit that particular characteristic. So I think I've always found that activity really lets students or individuals have insight and awareness. They don't have to share it with anyone. And then when we're in class and we're talking about these different variables, then they can still continue to have these ahas and can push better, so to speak, through it.
Yeah, that's a really good example of something that I think would go over well in an intro class.
Mm-hmm. Definitely intro. Yeah, thank you.
I like that. Thank you for sharing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Anne, do you have any more questions? We are getting a little closer to 11, about 10 till.
Well, we do. We have one final question.
Okay.
And it's kind of more reflective on all of what we've talked about. And we'd like you to, I'm going to put up the question, but we'd like you to use the poll, use the chat box so that we can keep track of some suggestions that people might have. So we're interested in using, having people use the chat box to share your recommendations on how you address some social justice aims in your quantitative research. So we've talked about a lot of different things. What are some suggestions that you might have? Oh, people are actually using the it forced us to, this is a good example of forced choice in quantitative work. It forced us to actually include two options. So people are saying they'll use the chat, but no one's writing in the chat. This is not a high validity item.
They might be just needing some processing time, you know, to come up with something. They have to formulate something.
All right. So we'd really like to get some ideas. What has our conversation today helped you think about in terms of changing how you approach quantitative work? You know, I think I'll start off. I think that this discussion and other discussions I've had with my colleagues and readings in the past is really about changing how we ask for background information and whether or not we need to ask for background information, because it's not always relevant to the research we might be conducting. So that's one thing that I've you know, given a lot of thought to.
And I would agree that I think the trying hard to capture the intersectionality would be really beneficial, because we know that we're not made up of just one piece. And I think today we talked about, you know, it's not just male or female, but is there a way to, you know, to capture that better in a you know, quantitative way? It's easier, I think, in qualitative studies because people will tell their story in some way, shape, or form. But quant, I never really thought that was possible, and I think maybe there are better ways to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the intersectionality, of course, goes also with respect to gender and race. You know, are we paying attention to the way white women are responding, you know, differently from Black women? And is that a thing? Is that something we need to think about?
And I like Tracy's idea of reflecting on our own positionality when we're actually out in the world doing research.
I liked your idea of making sure that you question every step of the way. In fact, I think I'm going to start including that as part of the write-up. You know, am I thinking about this, you know, every step of the way? What is the question that I am posing to myself in the research?
Okay, and I'm just pointing out, Scott's posted an example looking at IQ tests in Black children.
And I want to remind everyone who wanted to share or give the group some takeaway reads, please make sure you put those in the chat so that they can copy the chat and have it at their leisure.
So I think another way that we can make sure we're addressing some of these issues in improving our own use of quantitative research is to really rely on pilot testing to help us understand how people are interpreting questions and making sure that we're even targeting the sample correctly that we intend to target. So I you know, for graduate students in particular, given the press and you know, the push and pull of needing to finish their research and not having money to fund perhaps the studies that they're interested in, still pushing them towards a really good pilot study could be beneficial in the long run. So I don't think it's a shortcut that can be overlooked, especially if we really want to encourage them to get useful information from the data that they have. Cognitive interviewing is a great strategy for learning about how people interpret questions. Thanks, Eric. So these are some really good suggestions.
I also, just to throw this out there, a student of mine and I were doing a piece on quant crit, and it's the merging of quantitative analysis and critical race theory. And in it, you know, when we got information back from the editor, it was very interesting because his comment, and we were trying to be so very astute about following quantitative conventions. And he said, you really need to think about accessibility, change the way you're talking about this when you're presenting it, because even though you have all of this correct, the very people that this is going to impact are not going to understand the language. So we had to go back and redissect, just the presentation of the findings so that it made plain sense. And I just think that's really valuable for quantitative researchers moving forward. Yes, I can show you, I know the conventions, but it's not helpful to the people that you're really studying if you can't put it in a language they can take away from it. So making the research and presentation much more accessible, I think, is important.
Some other comments or suggestions on tools perhaps that people have used?
I didn't want to share a tool, but it's just something that I just want to kind of put out there. I enjoyed reading the articles. It really kind of confirmed a lot of things that I've known for years. I'm happy that, we're in this social justice, this movement, and things are coming to light. Research that at one point I think was discouraged is now being encouraged. But I think kind of the big takeaway from all of this is to keep in mind at all times in all phases of everything that we do, that we're dealing with humans and that we're dealing with people with emotions who may have been marginalized or minoritized, or they have been put in a position of a deficit, and that all that we can do to bring light to issues, to think of things from a positive perspective and how we can ensure that some of the injustices no longer occur. I think that that's very important for all of us. And I just wanted, I can't say enough, remember we're dealing with human beings. And that last article that we talked about was the dehumanizing nature of the way in which we sometimes find ourselves categorizing people and putting them into these slots. But at the end of the day, I just ask that, in all that we do, remember that we are dealing with people.
Agreed. Thank you. Anne, you're not on, hon.
Sorry, I have a barking dog here. That was brilliant, Dorinda. Very well said. And I think that's a great summary of what, we hope people have, can give more thought to in their own work. And we hope that this discussion and at least the initial articles that we've selected have really stimulated people's thoughts much more strongly in these areas.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions? We're at the last 5 minutes of the hour. Does anyone have any questions for Dorinda or Minjung, Jessica, or Anne, or Tracy? Tracy, I'm sorry. These are the experts on the panel with us today.
We're moderators. I'm still a learner. I would never call myself an.
So I have a question. If we run into some issues, would we be able to bounce some things off of any one of the 5 of you to see where we are in our thinking? Because I'll be honest, I'm moving very fast. And sometimes, our students, like you said, are trying to get things finished. And I don't want to gloss over things that are, I'm pretty careful about the sensitivity part, that Dorinda brought up, thinking about these the participants as people and not subjects. But truthfully in the craft, you start moving pretty quickly and you just don't want to run into error. So.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think this exchange needs to be mutual. And I've already learned a lot, from listening to those of you who have come. I've learned a lot from my colleagues as we prepared for this, discussion. So I hope it's just mutual and we can reach out to each other. I would like to suggest one thing though, if we'll put together a little resource list about the readings and some of the links in the chat, right, so that we can have that in one area.
That's perfect.
And just one general thought, not just for you, but directing it toward you, I guess, is that when using a large data set, are there tools that one could use to apply a social justice lens to see if the individuals charged with collecting, that information were doing it with fidelity? You know, and is it just as simple as looking to see how they track gender, or, you know, because I think that's big, because you find some large data set and it's like, you know, a birthday gift. Here we go. You know, I'm going to look at just this question, but how do we know that maybe that information wasn't gathered in a
Yeah.
narrow way?
That's a great question. And one of the things, you know, from, and Dorinda, you probably have some thoughts on this too, having taught that sampling and survey research methods class, is that one of the things that I encourage my students to do is to really do the in-depth work necessary to learn about the sample and how it was collected, who was excluded. There's a lot of rich information on, you know, for a lot of these public use surveys that describes the sampling process. And so you need to do the work to see who's been excluded. I think it's not just who's in your sample, but it's who's not in your sample, because that's how we can begin to understand what the, you know, the usefulness and the meaningfulness of the results that we get.
Thank you. Okay, we are at the top of the hour, everyone. Thank you for giving us your time and for this rich conversation. This was great. Don't forget that on February the 19th, Penny Pasquet is going to come and talk to you about What More Can I Do? An exploration of critical advocacy research and decision points toward educational equity and social justice in qualitative work. Thank you so much, everyone. You guys have a great day.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Karen?